Okay, so my presentation's who's what, and it's sort of a dive into why beneficial ownership is needed for housing justice. So quick overview. This is me. I'm Branden DuPont. I'm a deputy director of analytics. This is a sort of a photo where I look the most like a banker. I promise I don't usually look like this. And I'm a sort of a data scientist and web developer. I do sort of a variety of different projects, both a lot of like deep analytics, but also I think a lot of really cool sort of like front end visualization, which means that I tend to do a lot of web development as well. I am the Deputy Director of Analytics at the Loyola Chicago Center for Criminal Justice. We have both of our co-directors, Don Steeman and Dave Olson, here with us today. And I was also a 2021 List Rubinger Fellow, which some of this work on sort of eviction and housing justice that I sort of delved into and I'm going to be talking about today, I sort of did during my fellowship. So quick plug for the Center for Criminal Justice. Center promotes fair, informed, effective, and ethical criminal justice approaches through collaborative interdisciplinary research, professional development, and targeted projects. I think we do a lot of really good work. We're a relatively new center, but you can see like a lot of our research is cited and we're all over the place. So these are just a number of places that we've worked with that cited us or featured us. So if you're interested in sort of partnering and learning more about us, you can go to our website and learn more. So I kind of gave a title to really explain sort of what beneficial ownership is and sort of how it can be helpful when we talk about housing justice. But I'm going to talk about three predatory and exploitative Milwaukee landlords first. And sort of the common theme behind all of these is really going to be, why these landlords be able to sort of engage in these like predatory and exploitative practices for so long without any sort of real accountability. So the first one I'm going to start with is a man named Elijah Muhammad Rashid, who sort of was a sort of feature of the real estate market in Milwaukee. He focused predominantly on low-income Black neighborhoods. He had sort of at his height about 180 rental properties. And he was eventually sort of convicted. His properties were taken from him in a civil suit after he was found guilty of kind of a racketeering scheme over 10 years. So the sort of most egregious conduct that he did is he would completely avoid paying any property taxes and property repairs at many of these properties. So you can see in this picture here, it's sort of like a standard for a lot of these pieces in problematic landlords is they just fail to maintain their properties at all. So what Elijah Muhammad Rashid would do is he would basically buy a property for cheap cash, and then he would completely fail to pay property taxes and property repairs. Eventually, there's sort of a policy at the city of Milwaukee where after 3 years, they would take the property into foreclosure. And what he would do is he would create a new LLC or business, and he would buy that property under a different name, and it would be sort of completely wiped of past due taxes and any sort of kind of requirement to fix up properties in the home in a timely fashion, right? Essentially reset the clock on when sort of maintenance violations had to be addressed by, and he would just never do that. And he was really able to operate at his height for quite some time. The next guy I'm going to talk about, this man was a recent feature. This is a 2022 story, I believe, out of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and ProPublica. And this is honestly just a really devastating story. So this man had about 65 properties. And one feature of that is very similar to Elijah Muhammad Rashid. he would not sort of maintain the properties up to code. And there was huge issues of electrical issues, wiring, and this led to fires. So the story of this piece by ProPublica in the Journal Sentinel really kind of tells like it's a story of two people, so one of his tenants and the landlord himself. And these three children actually died in a fire at one of these man's rental properties. And what happened is she was working at the time and was actually charged with criminal neglect of a child and received 18 years in prison. Even though it was later revealed that Todd Brunner had sort of a network of properties that he hid under a bunch of LLCs and systematically did not maintain them, and many of his properties had fires. When he was finally sort of convicted, he faced 15 counts and a combined max sentence of 350 years. This is a prosecution that included everybody from HUD to the FBI to local law enforcement agencies. He only got about 2 years of probation. And the last one I'll talk about is a recent story. I think when they sent out the invite for this talk, they sort of featured a story about this man named Curtis Haw. This is something that I contributed to. It's an investigative piece by the Milwaukee Journal. And I had previously done work in Milwaukee where I built the city's first sort of eviction tracking system. Right? So prior to some of my work, there was nobody who was really tracking how often how often evictions were happening, and then increasingly who are the large sort of actors behind these evictions, who's driving these evictions, which are really landlords, right? And one of the things I found from sort of previous analyses that made it into this final story is there's this man named Curtis Haw. He's the second biggest evictor in Milwaukee, and he had kind of completely flown under the radar, despite operating for like 10 to 15 years. And it's, again, Black low-income neighborhoods. He was such a prolific evictor that he would file 9 evictions for every 10 units he owned, basically every year. To give you a sense of what that means is basically every unit he owns basically getting an eviction filed every single year. So he's engaging in what's considered a practice called serial eviction filing, where he's filing evictions kind of in a counterintuitive way, not necessarily to remove the tenant from the property, but as a way to collect rent. So typically what happens when you're a slumlord in this circumstance, you have tenants that are really rent burdened, right? And when they face price shock, they have a decision to make, right? If my car breaks down, I only have $500. Do I pay to fix my car so I can get to work, or do I pay my landlord? And what a serial evictor will do is they'll use eviction as a tool to prioritize who gets paid first, right? And they're essentially using the court as their debt collector, right? And you see the practice of serial eviction filings happening, especially in places where the cost of filing eviction is really low. So similar to a lot of these other landlords, he would also sort of fail to maintain any of his properties sort of in any way. If you read the story, which is just a really incredible piece, one of his property managers actually went to the city with like work orders that he would fail to do just because he could no longer like work for this man and like fail to maintain any of these properties. But really the city ignored. At its height, before he sold off a lot of his properties during the pandemic, he had about 700 units and an estimated sort of yearly revenue well into the millions. So one of the things I'll talk about is all of these landlords are able to actually operate in sort of a way that is exploitative, harmful, devastates people's lives, but it's also incredibly profitable. And it's not just profitable for like your atypical slumlord. Really, anytime you're a landlord in sort of like a poor neighborhood, again, a little counterintuitively, the profit margins are actually much higher. So this is a Desmond and Williams paper in 2019. And they found in Milwaukee, landlords make a profit of about $150 per month. And this is just pure profit in poor neighborhoods compared to roughly $20 a month in non-poor neighborhoods. The profit margins are actually much higher. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that sort of rent has a floor. So when you think about any city in the country, rent at a certain point doesn't get any lower. And people are paying more of their income. So I think one statistic that kind of really drives this home is that in these poor neighborhoods where these landlords were operating, the median Milwaukee renter is paying their entire assessed value of their home in, it should say, 4 years. And that's essentially how sort of unmoored the assessed value and what these landlords are extracting in rent. So now I'm going to kind of get into the sort of like unifying item behind sort of everything I've talked about, which is that property ownership is often organized under limited liability companies. And this is a setup that allows them to sort of obscure their identity and shield their liability from really any sort of accountability. And I'm going to go over Anchor Properties Group as like a quick little visualization to kind of drive this home. So when you look at Anchor Properties Group and you look at them operating from 2016 to 2021 at kind of at first size, if you just look at their LLC, they really appear to be kind of like a mid-sized landlord. They have 99 evictions, which is a lot, but it's only about 17 properties. So typically what happens is, you can imagine like a keen court clerk or legal aid attorney might begin to notice that you have the same attorney that's representing other similar named LLCs in court, right? And they all kind of had the same name. So in Anchor Properties Group or Curtis Hoff, who's the left landlord that I mentioned, you'd see that he has all these A names, a bunch of Anchor, Action, and a ton of. The reason they're all A's is because the court had a policy to sort who would be able to show up each day by alphabetically. So if your LLC name started with an A, you'd be able to go first. So say you link these four together, now you have a sense that these A-name plaintiffs make up a larger landlord than previously thought, right? So over 5 years, this portfolio filed about 919 evictions at 100 buildings. This is nearly 10 times the previous estimate, but it's actually limited. So if you actually link LLCs to property records, which is kind of best practice, but still limited, you can see that the portfolio in the network is much, much larger, right? So when you link them all together, you can find about 22 known LLCs. Turns out to be Milwaukee's largest evictor, and over 5 years, they filed an estimated 3,144 evictions at 387 buildings. So not only are they sort of really prolific evictor, but they also have a high relative rate. So once you're able to link together sort of true property ownership and landlords, you're also able to make comparisons to sort of other housing providers or other folks, right? So you're able to say, like, how does this compare to like social housing or like a mom and pop landlord or Section 8, right? So in this instance, I took a comparison to the Housing Authority in Milwaukee, and they have an eviction rate of about 3%, right? Much, much lower. And also consistent with what you see for other sort of like mom and pop landlords in this neighborhood. So who the landlord size is actually a huge predictor of whether or not you have the potential risk for facing an eviction, right? So basically, this network of LLCs are used to essentially obscure your identity and then also shield themselves from liability. So it's really difficult if you're going to go after a landlord for these poor practices, because they can just, give up any of those properties. And oftentimes, even if you were going to purchase the properties back from these landlords, they're oftentimes not in any sort of good state. So anchor properties in particular, we're seeing sort of a larger consolidation of corporate landlords who are understanding kind of this profit margin in poor neighborhoods, right? And they're starting to buy up a lot of these single and two family homes in, again, like low-income Black neighborhoods. They're in the sort of interview piece that I mentioned, they interviewed several of these sort of corporate landlords who actively said that the conditions at these properties were so bad that they're removed from any sort of acquisition deal. So what do we do about this? So basically, housing enforcement relies on understanding the people who benefit from ownership, right? Hence the beneficial ownership in my initial sort of title slide. And that's basically to say that there's a person at the end of a chain of the sometimes nested company ownership that you'll see, right? And this term is called, so here's like a really great diagram. There's sort of an organization called the Open Ownership Project that essentially writes a lot of policy briefs on this topic. And they also have like a data standard that's used. The Open Ownership Project actually hasn't done that much in the United States because we don't have sort of like strong transparency laws. But if you look at like the UK, despite a lot of struggles right now, any sort of LLC sort of ownership and how it's sort of broken down is available to any member of the public on like a open data portal that they can search. But to give you a sense of like why beneficial ownership is so helpful, this is like a nice little diagram where you can see that you have these 4 companies, right, that will sometimes have like ownership of themselves, sometimes called like shell companies, right? But you can see at the end of it, person A, right, up here is really the one who's sort of controlling both the ownership and the financial decisions behind the sort of nested companies. So really, beneficial ownership is the right to some share of a legal entity's ownership, income or assets, right? The right to direct or influence the entity's activities. So it's this 2 sort of contrasting things, ownership and control, right? And the Open Ownership Project actually sort of has like a legal standard, and I think sometimes more importantly, a data standard on like how this information can be structured. So currently, there's like intermediate best practices. So when I showed you the sort of scrolling visualization of this landlord's portfolio that slowly started to expand, and you can see it's like true eviction rate. That's using something called network analysis. So you're linking oftentimes the business address and the owner name into a network, and you're able to find sometimes previously unseen connections. Some of the like pioneers on this work is a group called Just Fix, who built out Who Owns What in New York, and this group that did Evictor book, which I encourage everyone to kind of look up and see some of their work. They did a sort of a really good job of sort of automating the sort of network analysis of this property ownership. Find My Landlord is also like a Chicago-based resource that has done some of this work, I don't think as detailed or in an ongoing basis. I think some of the data is currently like a little dated, but also like a really valuable tool. So this is like a great practical solution that starts sort of unpeeling this kind of issue of these landlords being able to operate in secret at a huge scale for so long. So one issue is that it can miss sophisticated ownership networks and true ownership and control, right? So I'll give you a sense. So if you look into some of these network analysis, you can see sometimes like complicated nested network of different property holdings, right? Sometimes, and so right here you have like name, and then you have all the associated business addresses, right? And when you fit them into a network, you can start to get a sense of what they look like. But the problem you have here is you don't know like true ownership. You don't know percentage of control and ownership. So you don't know, is there like 2 or 3 people behind this? Is Neil Sullivan himself like a property manager or an agent? And you also see, sort of with the rise of sort of corporate institutional landlords, the ability to be a lot more sophisticated in this work, right? Where they can essentially create a shell company that is sort of at the center of this network. So it's a very good solution. It's something that I've done to do this type of work. But on the other flip side, here's New York, and you can see this is companies related to Jared Kushner. His father is sort of huge in real estate, I think still is. You can see like trying to start dig into like really complicated, sometimes national networks can like quickly become a little unreasonable and difficult to tease out, requiring a much more manual process and still removing an understanding of kind of true ownership. So I'm next going to talk about the legal landscape on beneficial ownership. So thankfully, there's some sort of awareness that this is an important problem, and we need to understand it. One issue that I think is present is a lot of times when people talk about making beneficial ownership data available, they're really concerned with like tax fraud and avoidance. And I don't see a lot of discussion on how beneficial ownership is actually really essential if we care about understanding like housing questions in our cities, right? Like I can't tell who Milwaukee's top landlords are for evictions if I don't have true beneficial ownership data, right? I can't tell if somebody is failing to maintain all of their properties because they have a bunch of code violations if there's 60 LLCs, right? And I don't know that they're linked together. So right now you have beneficial ownership disclosure at the federal and state level. So there was actually an act at the federal government called the 2021 Corporate Transparency Act. It's sort of a huge, huge deal. It was passed over Trump's veto. It's currently only, the data is going to start mandating that any like true beneficial owner, so anybody who has a 25% stake in a company through a nested chain now has to report who's actually benefiting and receiving money. But this is only available to the federal government. Currently, it's being directed through their sort of treasury enforcement. And there is a provision in the law to disclose some of this data to local government through a court order. However, one of the problems with this is it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem. So you don't know who to ask for unless you have the data in the first place, oftentimes, right? And you also need a court order, so you're going to need some sort of justification that sort of piercing this LLC bail is viable. So really, this is information that's available to the federal government, but it will miss a lot of the local nuance piece because so much of it was focused on the sort of federal like anti-corruption work, and less about why this data is really important for housing justice. So there is some movement at the California and New York to pass LLC transparency. So there's a LLC Transparency Act, which is specifically defining that beneficial ownership needs to be released in sort of a structured electronic way, which is really fantastic. There's a similar bill in California that I really haven't included here on the slide because it's kind of been held up in the committee for the next 3 years. But there really is no reason why Illinois couldn't do something similar. And we would be the first state to do so. So one thing that the center's really focused on is also this sort of rise of reform-minded or progressive prosecutors. So Manhattan's district attorney has started a new housing and tenant protection unit. They're kind of really the first in the country to do this type of work. They actually put in a letter of support for the New York law on beneficial ownership, and I think could serve as kind of a national model for a lot of this work. One of the benefits to having sort of like a law enforcement partner is they can sometimes act like argue for privileged data access, which is sometimes being treated, this LLC transparency. So they could potentially serve as kind of like a third way to access some of this data. I'll give you an example. So right now, one concern is that behind New York's law is that if you release any of this data, there's privacy concerns, right? And corporations should be able to shield their identity to a certain extent. There's an EU court that struck down beneficial ownership disclosure across the EU, basically for that reason. So one thing that we've been thinking about, and I think is important to keep in mind, is while not perfect, and while I think that the best way is to have like true beneficial ownership to the public, if we think of it from the perspective of sort of being able to hold bad landlords accountable in a consistent way, this could be an approach that they're able to have sort of a sensitive access to the beneficial owners behind these LLCs, while being sort of a local partner that cares about what's happening on the ground level in a way that sometimes the federal government can't do. So we also have a reform-minded progressive prosecutor in State's Attorney Kim Fox, and there's potentially the opportunity to do similar work. So I think I've talked a lot about kind of what beneficial ownership data is. I really recommend everybody go to the Open Ownership Project if you want a really deep dive into that. And then I've also talked about sort of a number of landlords and essentially how they've used LLCs to sort of shield themselves. But just kind of wrap it up, I want to talk about sort of all how the things that we think about with like really horrible, egregious housing exploitation practices can tie themselves back into beneficial ownership. So the first one we'll talk about is deed fraud. So deed fraud is basically a classic example is somebody is facing foreclosure, and some party comes out of nowhere and says, "I'll help you with it. I'll give you a little bit of money to sort of keep you on your feet so you don't have to lose your home," right? And it turns out the deal they give you actually buys the property at a really low cost. And this family loses their home, and they're actually worse off than if they went through foreclosure, right? So behind deed fraud is a group of people that are essentially trying to buy as many properties as possible to profit, right? So oftentimes the most egregious deed fraud happens at scale, right? And you can measure this in data if you have beneficial ownership. So imagine, if you will, that sort of LLC or company that has propped themselves up and is buying up a bunch of these homes. Now all you need to do is look at homes that are essentially going at a price below market rent, and then you can see if there's consistent actors. And you now have the ability to sort of flag this sort of anomaly and sort of catch deed fraud much more quicker now that you know who is behind these LLCs snapping up these properties. I'll give you an example for retaliatory evictions, which is some work that I did in Milwaukee. So retaliatory evictions is a really difficult thing to measure, right? Because oftentimes the tenant doesn't know that it's retaliation, or they're not able to bring it up in court. At least in Milwaukee, there's about a 50% default rate for eviction cases, right? So oftentimes tenants aren't even coming to court to sort of raise an issue like retaliation. And then sometimes it doesn't matter, right? We don't have good cause eviction in a lot of places that say that a landlord needs to have sort of like documented non-payment of rent, right? So one thing I looked at in Milwaukee is how often does evictions happen very shortly after there's some sort of code violation, right? 30 days, 60 days. And I found that about 15% of single family homes had an eviction shortly after they raised sort of a building code violation related to sort of like habitability. So it's a huge problem. But if you take that to like a city attorney or a prosecutor and you say this is happening, what they're going to want to see is like a pattern in practice. And if you have, again, a series of 50 LLCs that you're unable to link together, you're unable to show that this is something a landlord is consistently doing, right? It looks like that sort of first bubble, right? Where it's like one LLC kind of doing this over time. Something I talked about a lot is a top evictor. So cities across the country, if you asked, like a chief judge or a mayor, who are your top 20 evictors, who are your top 10 evictors, they can't answer you. Partly it's because eviction data can be really tough to come by. But the other part is that landlords will use these LLCs to obscure their identity, and it makes linking to the true owner behind it difficult. So if you ever go to Eviction Lab's website, you can see, and they've had this up for about, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years since they started their work on sort of national eviction data. But there's a little tab that's grayed out and it said top evictors coming soon, right? And it's again because this problem is unsolved that we're seeing this happening. Serial eviction filing, code violation enforcement, and then the rise of institutional investors are all things I think I talked about before, but it's kind of the same idea, is that understanding sort of bad actors really requires you to know if it's just sort of a one-off or if it's part of like a sort of a coordinated campaign by a larger actor. So I kind of end this and sort of open up to the question and say, next, beneficial ownership disclosure in Illinois.
Thanks, Branden. I think what we'll do here is just, if you know how to use the, if you remember from the last time you were on a Zoom meeting, how to do the raise your hand icon, go for it. Otherwise, just go ahead and unmute yourself and shout out questions. Branden, why don't you go ahead and pull down the screen sharing and
yeah,
we can see each other. So we can see your,
yes.
There we go. Thanks. Questions?
Should I just jump in?
Please do.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Hey, thank you so much for your presentation. It's Emily at University of Chicago. I've been doing some research on looking at ownership in Chicago. And I wondered if you had, and it's, pretty much a mess as you've been describing with all the LLCs and getting the data from the assessor, the parcel level data, and then trying to understand aggregated ownership and where that is kind of a mess. So I just have a really practical question about who you could point me to that you think is particularly adept at navigating through all those ownership issues and how to, kind of a data geek person. You mentioned the Find My Landlord in Chicago, and that website seems to just be spinning around. So I don't know if that's active or if you know anybody to suggest.
Yeah. So I can say, like, selfishly, me, like I've directly done a lot of this work. I think most of my expertise is in like technically solving this problem. So really, and I can also send you kind of sort of like an overview of some of this work that I've done. The scroll viz that I showed you is kind of part of a larger report that talks about what's kind of needed to kind of like start building what's oftentimes called like property ownership mapping. So if you're looking for folks like methods, you can go to Who Owns What NYC, or if you go to Find My Landlord, you can kind of see how they've done that. Who Owns What NYC and Evictor Book, which are both places that I mentioned in the presentation, are folks that have a really detailed methodology guide on like how they approach some of this work. The data part of this is really kind of if you're trying to just start piecing together networks and sort of doing sort of like a qualitative review of these sort of really deeply nested corporate structures that I've kind of showed you. Typically what you're going to need is housing assessor data, property ownership data, and real estate transfer data. And the real estate transfer data is really key because oftentimes property ownership will change hands, and you want to be able to distinguish, is this potentially the same property owner? They're just changing out their LLC. And you can sometimes see that when their sort of business address stays the same, right? Or they're part of a larger network. Really important to distinguish when we think about this over time. So it can get really complicated, but it's really the work itself is linking together a bunch of this data in a network. I use Python Network X. Actually, Peter and I had a conversation about this previously, like how to like functionally do this. And I'd be more than happy to sort of meet with you if you're like interested in sort of talking about like actually like how to do this, in a program, and start teasing that out. But yeah, use Python Network X, link together all this data.
That would be great. Can you share your email or?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
And then I'll send over some of these sessions.
Other questions? There was one up here about whether anybody knows, Brandon, I don't think you would know this necessarily, but whether Kim Fox, Cook County State's Attorney, or any other Chicago office expressed interest in this sort of work, and any proposals?
I don't know if Kim Fox has done any of this formally. I see Don is eating some food. We have done work with Kim Fox's office, and I know that their office talks in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, and it's really interested in some of the work they're doing. But I don't know if they've sort of formally said anything.
They haven't. We work with Kim Fox's office on other projects around prosecutorial performance indicators, but we haven't talked to them specifically about doing work with landlords. But the Manhattan DA's office has reached out to us, and Brandon's had some initial conversations with Alvin Bragg's office about helping him set up a special prosecution unit to target landlords.
And Curl has an ongoing partnership with the Law Center for Better Housing, that with Peter Rosenblatt and others, and now Brandon, that is exploring various options. That's the short version. You can circle back to me if you have questions or follow up.
Yeah, and some of the initial conversations in Manhattan's office is there's typically one, I want to sort of make them aware that sort of beneficial ownership is kind of pending in the New York Senate, and that this is something they should look into supporting. I can also try to send that over to the group so you can see what like a good legislative piece for sort of releasing this transparency would be. But then the other thing we were talking about working with the NDA's office is once you get this data, you actually have to like fit it into a network, and you have to link it to all these other data sets, right? So like linking property ownership and parcel data to an eviction record is complicated and non-trivial. So that's one of the things that I've done in Milwaukee, and we're thinking about doing in other places, is sort of build a system that like automatically links eviction record to sort of property ownership and is able to parse out these networks in a sort of a semi-automated way.
Thanks. Other questions? Gina.
Hi. So I'm just wondering, to what extent have you been able to or tried to even incorporate sort of informal evictions, so out of court evictions that occur, such as like, you know, when sort of developers are coming in, buy a building, and then find, you know, sneaky ways to sort of force everyone out of a building. Just asking because we see that happen a lot. I'm not sure what the estimations of the percentages are of evictions that occur sort of outside of the court system versus, you know, through the court system, but my sense is that there's a significant amount that occur sort of unofficially. So just like you to speak to that if possible.
Yeah, that was so. I built Milwaukee's first eviction tracking system, and I kind of like was in the shadow of Matt Desmond writing the book Evicted, right, which came out kind of the same year. And there was sort of like this huge emphasis in Milwaukee about like understanding the problem. And I think one of his sort of key pieces of work and insight was that most of the evictions were these informal evictions, right? And part of the problem from like a measurement and quantitative sort of approach to try to get an understanding of this is really he did like really intensive costly surveys, right? And that was how he was able to get at the data. So I think you can do like survey and sampling, but I honestly don't know like a better way to kind of get at some of these estimates. I do know that there's like some talk about like the potential for like civic tech or legal tech for like tenants to essentially raise that this has been sort of done to them or that this has been asked of them, and sort of like sampling in that way. But right now there isn't sort of like a good handle on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's interesting to be sort of think about creating a clearinghouse for people to be able to report that, self-report it. So Dave Olson.
Great presentation, Brandon. I don't know if it's a question. I'll ask the question part first, and I assume I know what the answer is, and then I'll say what I think would be very interesting to look at. In the eviction data, does it specify the name of the individual to be evicted? So I mean, in other words, is that data publicly available? And then the question I have, and maybe folks on the call have already kind of looked into this or thought about it, but it would be interesting to see how often an individual is evicted from different properties, but properties that are owned by the same individual, right? So you show those networks of properties owned, and you could envision somebody being evicted, being forced out of their home, and then they find another place to live in the community that's owned by a different company, and in their mind it may be owned by a different individual, and so they're really subsequently evicted by, again, the same person. So it's almost like, you know, serial eviction for the individual. So I don't know if that's something that's been looked at or if that's even possible.
So I would say in part, I think that's a really good question. So I think one thing that there's a growing understanding around is that if you have an eviction on your record, it sort of like subclasses you as a tenant, right? It's like where you can rent from is now changed, right? And who you can rent from. And to kind of your point, Dave, there is sort of like detailed information about a defendant address and first and last name, where you could start tracking some of this information. One of the complications is oftentimes to get a reliable match outside of an individual address to another address can become complicated because there oftentimes isn't other identifiable information in the court record. So you can link pretty reliably to an address because you have first name, last name, the address, and point in time, right? So there's been some interest in Milwaukee in linking this data for like truancy purposes to see if there's sort of been sort of disruption in the home and then they're sort of not showing up. And if you have another data set where you have, I know this person's first, last name, address, and the time that they're at that address, you can make a reliable match to that person using administrative data. However, as soon as you do the same person, different address, that can become less reliable because you don't have information like date of birth, gender, or sex, right? As part of sort of the civil legal process. In criminal case data, that data is oftentimes more readily available.
Yeah. Just interesting because it's almost as, you know, the landlord evicts you and as a result gives you a lower rating. And if they release to you, they're justified in charging you more because you're a higher risk, right? So it's almost like they're able to elevate what you're going to pay by their past decisions on how you're treated. So
Yeah. That's in some of the serial eviction filing literature. I think they've done interviews where like some landlords talk about that as like an explicit strategy, because you're actually using it to grow your pool of tenants, right? Because if you evict somebody, now that's all you can essentially rent from are these like essentially like landlords. They're the only people that will take you.
Peter, you had your hand up earlier? Yeah.
I was sort of going to say what Branden said at the very end there, just thinking about the sort of from the tenant or landlord perspective and the sort of tenants that are, you know, when losing a home and really looking for a new place, it's not uncommon for them to get recommendations from their own landlord for another place. And you know, as Branden mentioned, right, that can feed into that kind of specialization in evictions or in that kind of low end of the property market and how you kind of keep that tenant base. So.
Other questions, comments? All right. Well, Branden, thank you for joining us. This is fascinating work. Thanks for all the links. You know, if folks haven't copied them or clicked on them yet, reach back out to us at Curl or to Branden directly, and we can get you connected. And yeah, we very much appreciate Branden's presentation, and also that he's a bright and shiny new colleague of ours here at the university. Just one couple of final words. Next week's, if you signed up for it, you got an email from me recently or from the system recently. Our speaker had a change in her availability, and so we are going to have to. We've canceled it. We're going to try and reschedule, but probably won't be until the fall, most likely. And then, of course, I just want to publicly thank Teresa in this space in particular for all her work over the years of getting Friday morning seminars together, getting them together during the pandemic, before the pandemic. So all the best from all of us at the Friday morning seminar gang. And of course, we have our own farewells for her here at Curl. But thanks, Teresa, for all your work over the years on this important part of what is Curl. So thanks. Godspeed.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'm going to miss you all. And but you are in good hands. David will take care of you this semester, so you have many more to look forward to. So it won't, they'll still be here after me.
We're gonna fake it through the rest of this semester. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend wherever you are, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.